Carol and Lyle Kopenkoskey had known each other almost all their lives.
Lyle married the girl next door.
They were very happy together. They were always laughing.
But then, after 39 years together, Lyle suddenly disappeared.
He didn't show up for work. The state police came and searched.
And when they finally found the missing man,
it was very obvious it was homicide.
Hear friends and family's reactions firsthand.
My wife and I was pretty shook.
I can't believe it. Why would somebody do it?
And follow along as the investigators search for the truth.
Generally, the closest people to the person are the people you look at first.
Was the couple's 39-year marriage really as rosy as it appeared?
They tried to keep it a secret.
Or did Carol have reason to get rid of Lyle?
Because she somehow snapped.
Emmett County, Michigan, October 2nd, 2012. It was early autumn, but the first snowfalls of winter were just weeks away in this sportsman's paradise at the tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula.
Wintertime skiing is big. Some snowmobiling, snowshoeing, cross-country skiing.
And while it was not even 10 o'clock, local resident Carl Kopenkoskey and his wife were getting ready for bed that chilly Tuesday night when they got a call from Carl's sister-in-law, 59-year-old Carol Kopenkoskey.
She called at 9:30 at night looking for Lyle.
58-year-old Lyle Kopenkoskey was Carl's brother.
Lyle lived just down the road from us.
But that night, according to Carol, Lyle had suddenly gone missing. In fact, Carol told her in-laws that Lyle had been missing all day.
Carol said Lyle didn't go to work today. They're trying to find him.
Tony immediately sat up in bed. She had an idea where the missing man might be. Earlier that day, she'd passed Lyle's truck parked on the side of the road not far from his house.
I seen the truck there and I thought, I wonder why Lyle's truck's sitting on the side of the road.
Carl passed the news to Carol.
I said, well, I maybe know where the truck is. And she says, do you want me to come to the house? I said, no, just stay home. I'll contact you.
So while Carol waited by the phone, Carl headed out to look for his brother's truck.
I went up to Keble Road. His truck was there. Dinner pail was on the front seat. Coffee was in the coffee holder, but Lyle wasn't in the truck.
So, growing worried, Lyle's brother pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911.
Told him my brother was missing.
Soon, the authorities would be on the hunt for the missing man. But to find the secret behind his disappearance, they would have to dig into his 39-year marriage to Carol. Born in 1953, Carol Dunkel grew up on a farm in Emmett County, Michigan.
She comes from a really decent, hardworking family in this area. They're respected.
She had 3 brothers. She was the only girl, so I think she was probably the spoiled little girl.
But she was also a tomboy who liked to tag along behind her older brothers.
Carol was a lively type gal. You wouldn't want to put anything past her. She would try to keep up with the boys.
It was easier for her to talk to men than it was a woman.
And not just her brothers either. There were also the 2 boys who lived down the road. The same age as Carol, Lyle Kopenkoskey lived on his family's farm with his older brother, Carl.
Carol was our neighbor, so we grew up together, all of us.
Carol became especially close to Lyle, drawn in by his easygoing nature.
He always had a smile, just an all-around jokester in a way. He'd make you laugh.
But while they had been playmates growing up, by the time they were teenagers, Lyle and Carol's friendship had grown into something more.
He started going with Carol in high school.
And once they graduated, 18-year-old Carol was ready to marry 17-year-old Lyle.
They wanted to get married in June.
Although the marriage didn't happen until the end of September 1973. So Lyle's brother could be there.
I was in the service, they were engaged, and I didn't get out of the service till September, so their wedding date was September 29th.
After the wedding, the couple moved into a house on one end of the Kopenkoskey family farm.
We all lived on the farm property. He lived on the north end of it, and I lived on the south end of the 110 acres.
And living less than half a mile apart made it easy to become friends with her new sister-in-law.
I'd always walk down to Lyle and Carol, chat a minute, and come home. I mean, I just was very good friends.
Lyle worked as a truck driver and heavy equipment operator.
He loved his work.
Carol, meanwhile, stayed busy with numerous part-time jobs.
She was a person who wasn't afraid to get out and work.
Carol had a cleaning job, cleaning business and that, and I went and cleaned with her on the weekends.
She would hold no fewer than 3 or 4 jobs. So she was always in a hurry, always rushing around, always late.
It was a hectic life, but a good one.
They were very happy together. They were always laughing.
Eventually, Lyle got promoted to a management position at the heavy equipment company. But he was always ready to get his hands dirty if needed.
Lyle worked in the office mostly, unless I needed a hand with a transmission or rear end. Then he'd come out and put his coveralls on and crawl right underneath there with it.
Carol didn't mind getting grubby either.
She used to dumpster dive. We were doing cleaning, and I'm just like, really? You're going to go dumpster diving? I never heard that, never saw it till I met her.
She would collect cans and whatever she could turn around and sell.
She went way beyond recycling, though, digging through dumpsters for items she could sell at yard sales and flea markets.
She'd find pieces of furniture. She would find glass stuff, just different things that she could sell.
Not that it was really about the money. Carol simply enjoyed the thrill of finding treasures in other people's trash.
That was her favorite thing.
And between Lyle's promotion, Carol's part-time jobs, and the money her yard sales brought in, the couple settled into a comfortable life.
Her and Lyle had all the toys that you can imagine.
And they had plenty of money left over for travel, too.
They were always on the go.
Avid NASCAR fans, the couple attended races all across the country, often traveling with Lyle's brother and his wife.
Lyle and I went to the races. That was his passion.
And in addition to racing, they regularly vacationed in the Ozarks.
We spent a lot of time together as couples.
Carol's in-laws weren't the only ones they traveled with either.
We went on many vacations with them. We went to Branson. We just had a really nice time with them.
Terry and I and Lyle and Carol took the snow train all the way up to Hearst, Ontario. We just had a ball together.
And whether with friends or alone, the couple also made regular trips to Florida.
They had a timeshare. They were always out and about.
But rural Michigan always remained home, especially for Lyle, who never tired of country life.
He'd sit on the front porch and watch traffic go by.
They would have big parties on the 4th of July.
Or they would just hang out with friends at the local diner.
We'd come over here to go to Big Boy, and we'd all meet there.
We were almost together every weekend.
But while their simple life was full of family and friends, there was one thing that Carol and Lyle didn't have.
Lyle and Carol didn't have any children.
Lyle would have given his life to have children, but that wasn't Carol's life. And that wasn't Carol's thing at all. She never wanted to hold the new babies, or once they got a little bit older, she could sit and play with them.
Besides, Carol and Lyle had built a life she clearly enjoyed.
She liked to have a good time and party.
She was a lot of fun. We've laughed a lot together.
And so did Lyle and Carol.
Lyle and Carol had a nice relationship.
It was a long-lasting one, too.
They were married for 39 years.
But on October 2nd, 2012, just 3 days after their 39th wedding anniversary, Lyle would get into his truck, drive off to work, and vanish. Coming up, the sheriff's deputies make a shocking discovery.
50 feet in front of the truck, not real visible from the road.
And the investigators uncover an important clue.
At that point, I knew we had a murder.
On the evening of October 2nd, 2012, 59-year-old Carol Kopenkoskey called her brother-in-law. and told him that her husband Lyle was missing.
She called at 9:30 at night looking for Lyle, saying that he didn't show up for work.
Lyle's brother Carl had an idea where the missing man might be, though. That afternoon, his wife had spotted Lyle's truck parked along a country road not far from their house.
He wouldn't leave his truck sitting on the side of the road for just no reason. So it wasn't right.
And when Carl Kopenkoskey found the truck, but no sign of his missing brother, he had called the police.
Lyle's brother had called in stating that Lyle was missing, but he found the truck abandoned on the side of the road.
A city officer came. They called in the county dogs. And then later on, the state police came and searched.
While they searched, Carol waited at her brother-in-law's, anxious for news of her missing husband.
Carol came up to the house, and she was pacing. She was very, very nervous about everything.
And after several tense hours, the searchers finally found something.
50 feet in front of the truck, not real visible from the road. The rescue team seen Lyle laying in the ditch.
It took some time due to the grade of the ditch, in addition to the way the weeds. It was pretty difficult to actually see the body.
Lyle's brother rushed forward at the first shout of discovery, but as he approached the search team,
they pulled me back and said no.
Lyle Kopenkoskey was dead, the victim of what appeared to be a single gunshot wound.
It was one to the side and temple, his head.
However, it didn't appear to be a suicide, especially since there was no gun.
We rolled the body over and found no weapon. At that point, I knew we had a murder.
And soon after that, the medical examiner arrived on the scene and erased any doubt.
Myself and the medical examiner find a bullet hole in the back.
Lyle had been shot a total of 5 times, most likely with a revolver.
No shell casings at the scene meant that the shell casings went with the murder.
And that didn't appear to be all the killer had taken away from the scene.
Lyle's wallet was missing.
Did the missing wallet mean Lyle was the victim of a deadly robbery? While the investigators processed the crime scene, Lyle's brother returned home with the awful news.
Carl came in and told us that Lyle had been shot.
My wife and I was pretty shook.
And Carol appeared devastated.
Carol just started, crying.
And she continued crying as family, friends, and even Carol's pastor began to arrive, offering their condolences.
She was a mess. She was just crying so hard and saying, I can't believe it, and why would somebody do it?
That's what the investigators were wondering, too.
It didn't make sense that he would have been robbed and killed. Who commits a robbery of someone and then a murder, a carjacking in effect, in northern Michigan in the middle of the morning on a country road?
Perhaps it had only been intended to look like a robbery, to divert attention away from Lyle's real killer.
Generally, the closest people are the people you look at first.
The wife, spouse, friends, relatives, somebody they've had a quarrel with, so on and so forth.
Hoping for some answers, the investigators joined the growing crowd at Carol's in-laws to take her preliminary statement.
I took Carol into a back room so I could get a more one-on-one with her.
Questioned by the investigators, Carol started out by repeating what she'd already told her friends and family, that she had no idea who might want her husband dead.
Lyle had no enemies.
Lyle was the type of person that would do anything for anybody.
He was just a great guy. He wouldn't hurt a fly.
Although according to Carol, her husband had been behaving strangely prior to his disappearance.
She started explaining that Lyle had a rough night prior to his murder.
She was saying that Lyle was all messed up.
He did like to drink.
However, according to Carol, she didn't think Lyle was just drunk.
She was stating is that he was not only intoxicated, but she thought that there was something mentally wrong.
That he had taken Ambien, sleeping medication, that he was wandering about the house.
And according to Carol, he was still acting strange the next morning.
He was high on drugs and alcohol. He never slept.
However, since he did have to go to work, Carol said she'd done everything she could to get Lyle on his way.
She makes his lunch, makes his coffee, and actually assists him in backing out his truck from the garage.
She didn't want him to back his truck out of their garage for fear he'd hit the woodpile.
That's what Carol claimed had happened, but it just didn't add up for the investigators.
That was the first piece of evidence. I said to myself, hey, there's something wrong here. No wife with a husband in that situation were to put him in a truck and let him go to work and drive that morning.
What loving wife would do that?
Setting that aside for the moment, the investigators discreetly moved the discussion to a new subject, a possible murder weapon.
We talked about guns that she had at her residence, and I'd asked if we could go see those guns.
Carol was more than happy to help.
I actually went down to the house with her, with the police officers, looking for her guns.
Lyle didn't have many guns. He had a deer rifle and a .22 they used for shooting varmints around the yard. And I do remember a pistol.
But while the search turned up evidence of the pistol,
there was a gun case that was basically for a .38 special.
This particular gun was nowhere to be found.
Not only was it missing, the .38 special just happened to be a revolver, which was exactly the same type of gun the investigators suspected could be the murder weapon.
The shell casings went with the person who murdered Lyle. That means that it's inside the gun, which would be a revolver.
It could have been a coincidence, but combined with Carol's odd claim that she sent Lyle off to work impaired, the investigator had to ask Carol the obvious question.
I asked Carol if she killed her husband.
Although caught off guard by the accusation, Carol's response was adamant.
Not only did she deny it, but she denied having anything to do with this case.
That's what Carol said, but her in-laws weren't so sure. For starters, Carol's sister-in-law told the investigators that the missing gun was actually Carol's. At least she said that's how Lyle described it when Carol showed her the gun.
We were all in the living room, and Lyle says, "Hey, Tony, go let Carol show you the newest thing she brought home."
It turned out to be a revolver.
Carol and I went in there and looked, and she reached in the safe and pulled the gun out.
A gun she'd apparently bought off one of her yard sale buddies.
Supposedly it was an unregistered gun.
In fact, according to her sister-in-law, Carol had even joked about it.
So if there's anybody you want to get rid of, just let me know.
Was it possible that Carol had used the missing gun to get rid of her husband? The investigators were starting to wonder, based on something her brother-in-law told them. Questioned by the investigators that same morning, Carl said that when he heard that Lyle had been shot, murder wasn't the first thing that came to mind.
Well, at first I thought possibly, that he might have harmed himself.
And the reason Carl feared that his brother Lyle might have killed himself?
Because he knew that Carol was going with another guy.
Carol was having an affair.
Coming up, is Carol's affair motive?
If this was going on, then she should just get a divorce.
Or could Lyle's murder be the work of a jealous lover?
He slid that knife right up to his throat.
By the morning of October 3rd, 2012, it had been roughly 12 hours since Carol Kopenkoskey had called her in-laws and reported that her husband, 58-year-old Lyle Kopenkoskey, was missing.
Carol called me about 9:30 at night and stated that Lyle didn't show up for work.
And it had only been a few hours since Lyle's dead body was found lying in a ditch near the couple's rural Michigan home, not far from his abandoned truck.
The body was located approximately about 25, 30 feet in front of the abandoned vehicle.
It was very obvious it was homicide because the nature of the gunshot wounds in the back.
The investigators already had an obvious suspect, too. Lyle's wife of nearly 40 years, Carol.
She had been having an affair.
And Carol's in-laws claimed that her husband had known all about it. According to what Lyle's brother had told the investigators, Carol was having an affair with a man named John Ernst, a man she'd known almost as long as her husband.
He's born and raised in Kopenkoskey, and we kind of all went to school together.
However, John had left the area after high school, enlisting in the service.
John was a former Marine.
He'd eventually left the Marine Corps, though, taking a job far from northern Michigan.
John lived in Clarksville, Tennessee.
But the old friends had reconnected around 2007 when John came to town for a high school reunion.
It was Lyle's 30th or 35th. That's where they ran into John.
And after the reunion, John began making the almost 12-hour drive to visit with his old friends on a regular basis.
He would come up every other weekend or so.
Every time we went down to Lyle and Carol's, John was there. Come weekends, John was there. And it was always, the threesome.
And when he wasn't hanging out with the couple, John started helping out Carol when she went on her dumpster diving and flea market ventures.
They were business partners.
However, it wasn't long before Carol's in-laws suspected she and John were more than just business partners.
They were just together too much.
In fact, Carol and John did little to hide what was going on between them, as one of her friends soon found out.
We went to Mackinac Island, my friend and Carol and myself. We had a few drinks on the island, and when we came back, Carol was in the back seat of her vehicle, and she was calling somebody on the cell phone. And I didn't think anything about it or anything. We went back to my house.
And they'd barely arrived back at Terry Ann's house when...
Here comes John walking through the door with a bottle of vodka.
John had a few drinks with Carol and her friends, and then...
The next thing, Carol and John were in the bedroom.
And according to her friend Terry Ann, Carol and John not only slipped off and had sex in her bedroom, they spent the night, too.
And all my friends left. I slept on the couch because I wasn't about to go upstairs to the other bedroom because it was just kind of weird.
And from that point on, Carol and John did little to hide their relationship for the next 5 years.
People would see them together at the store, here and there, so they knew that they were going together. It wasn't a secret.
Not even from Lyle.
He knew about it. He mentioned it.
He spoke and said, "I'm sick and tired of John."
However, as sick as Lyle allegedly was of John and Carol's relationship, his friends and family said he never really did anything about it.
He drank a little bit, tried to hope, I guess, that it would go away.
And instead of admitting that his marriage was over,
when John got involved, it just went downhill from there.
Lyle spent the next 5 years holding on to hope, shrugging off advice that he should divorce Carol.
He loved her.
And Carol? She appeared perfectly happy carrying on with her marriage while she carried on with John.
We weren't happy with Carol. If this was going on, then she should just get a divorce.
But what about John? Had he been happy to go along? Or had he decided to take Lyle out of the picture?
My number one question was John Ernst involved with this?
Not only did John's affair give him an obvious motive to kill Lyle, when the investigators started questioning Lyle and Carol's friends, they discovered that John had already had one violent encounter with Lyle. According to what Lyle and Carol's friends told the investigators, the incident had occurred early in the relationship, back in 2007.
We were catering a friend's wedding. We were cleaning up in the back room after we've catered.
And while they were cleaning, John burst into the kitchen.
He was very drunk.
He went after Lyle with a paring knife.
He grabbed Lyle, slid that knife right up to his throat.
And according to Lyle and Carol's friends, John might have killed him then and there, if not for one thing.
Carol started hollering at John. John threw the knife down, and then he walked off.
After John left, Lyle's friends had urged him to call the police, but he said no.
Because it was a friend's wedding.
Lyle didn't want to have the police there while the party was going on.
In fact, his friend said Lyle didn't really do anything about the incident.
Lyle just kind of blew it off. Didn't even get upset about it. How could somebody stick a knife to your throat and you still talk to him a week later, 2 weeks later? That's how easygoing Lyle is.
Lyle might have blown it off, but had John. When the investigators called him the morning after Lyle's body had been found, he acted as if it was the first he'd heard of Lyle's murder.
I had asked John and informed him what was happening, what was going on. John denied knowing anything. Anything that had happened, appeared to be surprised.
Still, the investigators requested that he give them an interview. And as it turned out, they wouldn't have to go to Tennessee to do it.
He flew in for the funeral. I was very uncomfortable with John there.
But it seems Carol wasn't.
John was over whispering to Carol in the corner.
But had John been around the morning of the murder as well? Once the investigators questioned him, the answer appeared to be no.
I was able to place him in Tennessee at work the day of the murder.
It appeared to be a rock-solid alibi, too.
He had actually had to use security cards to get into offices and at the job site that he was working at.
But while the investigators couldn't tie John directly to the murder, did that mean he was entirely off the hook? Lyle's family didn't think so.
I believe John Ernst was involved with what Carol had planned to do. I believe they talked about it, made plans to what they were going to do.
And when the investigators pulled Carol and John's cell phone records, they began to suspect the same thing.
On the very day of the murder, she's calling John Ernst several times.
And John's claim to be surprised when the investigators told him that Lyle was dead? Based on Carol's cell phone records, that was a lie.
He knew all along. He had actually talked to Carol twice that morning.
But even more damning for Carol was the one person she hadn't called on the day Lyle disappeared.
She doesn't call her missing husband. She was specifically asked at 9 or 10 p.m. by the police to call his cell phone. That was the first time, according to his cell phone records, that she actually tried to reach him.
And a week after Lyle's body was found, when the investigators descended on Carol and Lyle's house with a search warrant, they made another suspicious discovery.
Several books on how to commit murder.
One was Forensics for Dummies.
Carol Kopenkoskey had certain sections of them indexed and highlighted.
The books, the affair, and the fact that she never tried to contact her supposedly missing husband. Adding it all up, the investigators were convinced that Carol was behind Lyle's death.
I think her motive had to do with just getting him out of the way so she could do whatever she wanted with John Ernst.
However, without a murder weapon or a confession, they weren't quite ready to make an arrest just yet.
It was a thin circumstantial case. There were just some odd circumstances that all seemed to point at her.
And as those odd circumstances piled up, the investigators continued to put pressure on Carol, interviewing her multiple times over the next several weeks.
Things were starting to add up, so my attitude with her became more heated, more direct.
She was hounded by the police.
Not that it did them any good. Carol continued to deny everything, even her affair with John Ernst.
She denied having anything to do with him.
John Ernst was a friend, somebody who treated her with respect, and she liked. She denies that there was any sexual relationship.
But Carol's denials didn't do her any good either. On January 2nd, figuring their case against her was as good as it was going to get, the Emmett County authorities placed Carol under arrest for her husband's murder.
We arrested her at her mother's home. When we entered the home, she was hiding in the bathroom.
Coming up, will Carol's boyfriend betray her?
We gave him immunity.
Or will a surprise witness change everything?
If he did not come forward with a person who committed murder.
On January 2nd, 2013, sheriff's deputies in Emmett County, Michigan arrested 59-year-old Carol Kopenkoskey for the murder of her husband, Lyle.
We all knew it was coming because they had no other suspects.
However, while the authorities had no other suspects, they didn't have a rock-solid case either.
We had no smoking gun.
This is a circumstantial case, yes. We have no witness. We obviously didn't have a confession.
And even as the prosecutors worked to strengthen their case, Carol was out of jail.
She was put out on bond, though. She was monitored.
She was not permitted to leave Emmett County.
But while the authorities only monitored Carol, the rest of the community essentially shunned her.
She lost all her jobs and nobody would touch her.
But would everyone desert her? In August of 2013, the prosecutors decided to put pressure on Carol's boyfriend, the man she'd openly been having an affair with in the years prior to Lyle's murder.
We brought John Ernst in and said to him, look, Mr. Ernst, we want to know what you know about this situation. We're going to put you under oath.
That wasn't all the prosecutors did either.
We gave him immunity.
And then they followed up the offer of immunity with a threat.
Any answer you give us, if it's not the truth, you have the possibility of being prosecuted for perjury.
Would the prosecution's carrot and stick approach convince John to betray Carol?
He denied ever sleeping with her, having a sexual relationship with her.
He was very loyal to Carol.
And then he continued to lie.
And most of all, he continued to deny knowing anything about the murder.
Mr. Ernst came in and gave us a statement indicating he knew nothing, did nothing.
Denied her ever having discussed the murder of Lyle with him, and denied helping her in any way cover up the crime. He did not give us any admissions, any help whatsoever.
And since John refused to cooperate with the prosecution, that left them in a bit of a bind when it came to putting Carol on trial for murder.
I was very concerned about whether I could get a conviction.
The case, it seemed, was at a standstill until January of 2014, 1 year after Carol's arrest.
I'll never forget this day for as long as I live.
It all started with an unexpected call.
I was in my office and received a phone call from an attorney who told me that he had a piece of evidence in the Carol Kopenkoskey case that he thought I would want.
Actually, the attorney had more than just evidence. He had a witness.
He had a client that Carol had approached asking him to kill her husband for money.
And not only was the would-be hitman willing to cooperate,
he realized that if he did not come forward with this information, it's possible that a person who committed murder would go off scot-free.
The informant also had evidence to back up his claim.
He had her phone numbers on his phone still. He had pictures of Lyle's license plate that Carol had given him, pictures of Lyle's truck, a map to their house.
It was the break the authorities had been waiting for.
That was a complete game changer. Now I felt extremely confident that we could get a conviction.
And on January 20th, 2014, after her year of limited freedom, the judge revoked Carol's bond. Sheriff's deputies took her back to the county jail, and the prosecutors offered her a deal, a chance to plead guilty to second-degree murder.
First-degree murder in Michigan is life without parole. Second degree is life, but you do have the possibility of parole.
However, there was one condition.
An admission from her as to what she did.
The whole scenario.
Carol took the deal.
I think it was in the best interest of both her attorney and her to take a plea.
And once she agreed to the plea, she sat down with the prosecutor, prepared to finally tell the truth.
So, as part of this agreement, you've agreed to tell us everything that happened today, and that's why we're here, right?
And for the first time, Carol tried to explain why she had killed Lyle.
I can't handle his drink and his abuse anymore.
While that's what Carol claimed, that didn't mean the prosecutor believed it.
He didn't fit the profile of a domestic abuser.
Lyle was not an abusive drunk. Lyle didn't have a mean bone in his body. Lyle would never in his life ever hit a woman.
And during her interview, when the prosecutor pressed her for details of Lyle's alleged abuse, Carol was painfully short on specifics.
Was there ever any type of physical abuse?
Not too often. I would say it was only been, half a dozen times. What happened? He would just push me around.
I tried to pin her down, and she never would really claim anything physical.
Carol did tell the prosecutor something that could be corroborated, though, that she had tried to hire someone to kill Lyle.
What did you say to the best of your recollection?
I might have said something like, do you want to do a job for me, or get rid of Lyle. I could have probably said get rid of Lyle. I said shoot somebody for me.
When did you provide him with the pictures? The picture of the truck with the license plate, the picture of Lyle, and the work schedules?
That would have been the last time we met.
In the woods?
Yes.
Okay. So you do acknowledge providing him with those documents?
Yes.
She denied it for so long, almost 2 years, and then all of a sudden, there we are in a room with her, debriefing her, and she's graphically walking us through every step of this.
But the deal had fallen through. And so on the night of October 1st, after Lyle had supposedly spent the night drinking,
He kept me up all night and just started irritating me.
Carol had decided to act.
When morning came, I just had to do it.
She claimed was that she was just tired of it. She was irritated and annoyed and just couldn't take it anymore.
I passed his lunch, I made his coffee. I went out and got the truck. I brought it out of the garage.
Carol said that she had stayed behind the wheel when Lyle walked out of the house.
I want to go drop me off somewhere so that I can walk back, get back to my exercise.
And about a mile from the house, she'd pulled over to the side of the road.
He got out of the passenger side and was walking around the driver's side. That's when I shot him.
It was chilling to sit there in a small room and listen to her admit how after she parked his truck on the side of the road, she starts shooting him as he's walking towards the driver's side to go to work.
And then he started running down the road, so I shot him again.
How many times did you shoot him? Where was the last shot?
Head.
She continues shooting until he's down in the ditch and shoots him in the head one last time. Premeditated, deliberate, cold-blooded.
Carol had also explained what had become of the missing revolver.
I took it and threw it over the bridge.
Which bridge?
Magpie.
And she insisted that she had done it to end her abusive marriage.
She believed something terrible was going to happen. Unfortunately, she made the wrong choice and decided to take the law into her own hands.
Coming up, will Carol take the plea?
Carol stood up and said that she was sorry.
Or will she find a way out of it?
Because she somehow snapped.
On February 25th, 2014, more than a year after her initial arrest, Carol Kopenkoskey was led into a Petoskey, Michigan courtroom for sentencing. In January, the 60-year-old had pleaded guilty to killing her husband Lyle in October of 2012 and leaving his body in a roadside ditch a mile from their rural Michigan home.
There's many little circumstantial pieces of evidence that all pointed at her.
And in a videotaped interview with the prosecutor, she had also detailed just how she had done it.
It was chilling how she recounted how she lured him out there and started shooting at him. How many times did you shoot him?
And while she had denied that her boyfriend John Ernst was in on the plan, she did confirm what the investigators had long suspected, that he knew she had done it.
Did you tell John that you killed Lyle?
Of course.
Tell us about that.
I didn't tell him a whole lot of details. I just told him I did it.
As a result, he'd been charged with perjury earlier that February.
Mr. Ernst gave us a statement that had a lot of falsehoods in it.
John's case was still pending, but that morning the judge sentenced Carol to 18 to 35 years in prison.
She's 60 years old, which means it's still likely that she'll die in prison.
Perhaps, although even the faint possibility that she'll live to be paroled left Lyle's family more than a little disappointed.
We weren't, as a family, happy with that. My children was not happy with that. She killed my brother in cold blood. She'd planned this. Life without parole is what should be the bottom line.
It was an assessment that at least some of the investigators shared.
I don't think 18 years is long enough. She deserved to spend the rest of her life in prison.
And as it turned out, there was another person dissatisfied with the outcome. Carol.
She had second thoughts and was remorseful about her plea deal.
She pled guilty to second-degree murder because she believed that her only choices were first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or an acquittal by the jury. She was not aware of the lesser offense of voluntary manslaughter,
which not only carried a much lesser sentence,
a maximum penalty of 10 to 15 years in prison.
According to her appeal, it was a more accurate description of the crime, too.
Because she somehow snapped.
She's trying to say she snapped because she was a victim of domestic violence.
Although the investigators and prosecutors who sent Carol to prison in the first place are convinced she's exactly where she belongs.
This was not a last-minute, hot-blooded, impulsive decision.
She lured him out there.
She was just a cold-blooded killer.
Routines have a way of creating dangerous assumptions. For highway patrol officers working the late shift along California's Interstate 5, a car drifting between lanes usually meant fatigue, alcohol, or a distracted driver. Most traffic stops ended with a citation, a warning, or an arrest for driving under the influence. They were ordinary moments that blended into countless nights spent watching headlights disappear into the darkness. On the night of May 14, 1983, two California Highway Patrol officers believed they were about to conduct one more routine stop. Instead, they unknowingly interrupted what investigators would later believe was one of the longest-running serial murder cases in American history. The driver appeared almost disappointingly ordinary. Randy Stephen Kraft was polite, composed, and cooperative. He spoke calmly, showed no signs of panic, and offered a simple explanation for the way his yellow Toyota Celica had been weaving along the highway. He had been drinking, he suggested. Nothing about his appearance hinted that the passenger sitting silently beside him had already taken his final breath. Nothing about the scene suggested that the officers were standing at the edge of an investigation that would stretch backward across more than a decade and force detectives to reopen dozens of unsolved homicide files. When one officer walked toward the passenger side of the vehicle, he initially believed the man inside had simply fallen asleep. The passenger's head rested motionless, his body leaning quietly in the seat. It was only after the beam of a flashlight illuminated his face that the terrible reality became impossible to ignore. His skin had turned pale. There was no response. Around his neck were unmistakable marks left by strangulation. The passenger was 25-year-old Terry Lee Gambrill. His body was still warm, indicating that he had been killed only a short time before the traffic stop. A routine roadside encounter had transformed, within seconds, into the scene of a homicide investigation. As officers searched the vehicle, the discoveries became increasingly disturbing. They found rope. They recovered tranquilizers. Alcohol was present. There were photographs. Most puzzling of all was a small piece of paper covered with 61 short coded entries. At first glance, the list appeared meaningless. Single words and brief phrases stood alone without explanation. Some read stable. Others included Edam, Wilmington, Twiggy, Angel, Hari Carey, Navy White, England, and Iowa. There were no dates, no full names, no obvious pattern. Yet experienced investigators immediately sensed that such a carefully preserved document was unlikely to be random. They could not yet understand what they were looking at, but they suspected the coded paper represented something deeply significant. In the months and years that followed, detectives would come to believe that the mysterious document had earned Randy Kraft the name by which history would remember him: the Scorecard Killer. The coded list would become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, because it seemed to suggest organization rather than impulse. Instead of random violence, investigators saw indications of planning, memory, and documentation. Each short phrase appeared capable of representing a person, a location, or an event known only to its author. Some entries would eventually be connected to known victims. Others remain unexplained even decades later, leaving investigators to wonder whether the true number of victims may never be fully known. Long before that night on Interstate 5, however, Randy Stephen Kraft had successfully built a life that attracted little suspicion. Born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California, he grew up in what appeared to be a stable middle-class family. There were no widely documented accounts of family violence or childhood abuse that investigators could point to as an obvious explanation for what he would later become. Friends and acquaintances generally remembered him as intelligent, reserved, and unusually private. He excelled academically, showed a strong interest in mathematics and science, and developed a reputation for being thoughtful rather than confrontational. During his years at Westminster High School, he performed well in school and participated in student activities. Nothing in those public achievements suggested that his name would one day become associated with one of the largest serial murder investigations in the United States. In 1963, Kraft enrolled at Claremont Men's College. It was during this period that he began acknowledging his homosexuality, although he remained highly discreet. The social climate of the 1960s was far less accepting than today, and many individuals concealed their personal lives to avoid discrimination. Those who knew Kraft continued to describe him as quiet, intelligent, and difficult to know deeply. He rarely displayed strong emotions publicly. He appeared organized, methodical, and careful in nearly everything he did. Later, he joined the United States Air Force in 1968, serving in administrative work while receiving computer-related training. Eventually, he was discharged for psychological reasons and returned to civilian life. His professional career developed within the growing computer industry, including employment with Lear Siegler Industries as a computer programmer. Once again, co-workers described an individual who seemed dependable, polite, soft-spoken, and technically skilled. The contrast between those descriptions and the allegations that would later emerge remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Investigators would eventually conclude that Kraft had managed to separate two entirely different identities. During the day, he appeared to be a successful professional with stable employment and ordinary routines. According to investigators, during nights and weekends he searched California's highways for vulnerable young men. That separation allowed suspicion to remain elsewhere for years. At the time, law enforcement agencies across different counties often worked independently, sharing far less information than modern investigators do today. Victims discovered in different jurisdictions were frequently investigated as isolated cases rather than components of a larger pattern. As a result, even as more bodies were recovered over the years, no single agency initially possessed the complete picture. According to investigators, Kraft allegedly targeted young males, particularly hitchhikers, military personnel, Marines, gay men, and others considered especially vulnerable because they could disappear without attracting immediate attention. Authorities believe that he frequently drove along major highways, offering rides to individuals traveling alone. Investigators later concluded that alcohol and tranquilizers played an important role in his method. Victims were allegedly rendered incapable of resisting before being restrained, sexually assaulted, tortured, and ultimately killed. Medical examinations in numerous cases documented strangulation as the cause of death, while also revealing evidence of severe physical abuse. Some victims suffered injuries believed to have been inflicted while they were still alive, while others displayed injuries that occurred after death. Several bodies had been redressed before being abandoned near highways, suggesting behavior that investigators interpreted as ritualistic rather than purely practical. Yet none of these conclusions had been reached on the night of May 14, 1983. Standing beside the yellow Toyota Celica, the officers could not yet know that they had interrupted what investigators believe had been operating for approximately 12 years. They did not know that future searches of Kraft's vehicle, apartment, and personal records would produce fingerprints, hair evidence, paint samples, travel records, military documents connected to victims, and thousands of photographs requiring painstaking examination. They did not know that detectives from California, Oregon, and Michigan would eventually begin comparing evidence from dozens of unsolved homicides. Most importantly, they did not yet realize that the coded scorecard found inside the vehicle might represent a key capable of connecting victims whose identities, stories, and final moments had remained separated by geography and time. Every major criminal investigation contains a moment that, in hindsight, seems almost impossibly fragile. A missed patrol, a different route, or a slightly later shift could have changed everything. On that May night in 1983, history turned on what first appeared to be nothing more than an impaired driver drifting across highway lanes. The stop ended with the discovery of one murdered passenger. It soon evolved into an investigation that would ultimately lead prosecutors to charge Randy Kraft with 16 counts of first-degree murder. Yet even as the legal case expanded, investigators would continue asking a far more unsettling question. If the coded scorecard truly represented a record of victims, how many names had never been identified, and how many families were still waiting for answers they might never fully receive? Those questions would define the investigation for decades to come, transforming one ordinary traffic stop into the beginning of a search for the full truth behind the man history would remember as the scorecard killer. Long before investigators associated Randy Stephen Kraft with one of the largest suspected serial murder investigations in American history, he appeared to be living a life that reflected stability, intelligence, and quiet achievement. To neighbors, classmates, coworkers, and casual acquaintances, there was little that distinguished him from thousands of other educated young professionals building careers during California's technological expansion. Looking backward after his arrest, investigators searched for obvious warning signs, hoping to identify the moment when the ordinary became extraordinary. Instead, they found a biography that offered remarkably few clear answers. Randy Stephen Kraft was born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California, to Opal and Phyllis Kraft. He grew up in what has generally been described as a stable middle-class household. Unlike many notorious criminal cases in which childhood histories reveal repeated violence, neglect, or severe abuse, investigators found no documented pattern of family brutality that could easily explain the crimes he would later be accused of committing. His parents provided a structured home environment, and nothing in the available records suggested that his early years stood apart from those of countless other American children growing up during the post-war era. This absence of an obvious catalyst would later become one of the enduring mysteries surrounding the case. During childhood, Kraft developed a reputation for intelligence rather than popularity. He excelled academically and displayed a particular interest in mathematics and science. Teachers viewed him as capable and disciplined. Rather than seeking attention, he tended to remain reserved. Friends were relatively few, and even those who knew him often described him as private. He appeared more comfortable solving problems than sharing emotions, preferring observation over participation in social drama. Such characteristics were hardly unusual on their own. Many successful students shared similar personalities, and nothing in his academic performance suggested that he would one day become the focus of a nationwide homicide investigation. At Westminster High School, Kraft continued to distinguish himself through his studies. He maintained strong grades and participated in student activities, earning the image of a dependable and intelligent young man. Those who interacted with him remembered someone who rarely caused conflict. He was organized, well-spoken, and generally polite. In retrospect, investigators found it striking how completely his public identity contrasted with the allegations that emerged decades later. There were no widely reported incidents of serious criminal behavior during his teenage years, no arrests that hinted at escalating violence, and no public episodes that immediately drew concern from those around him. If anything, his school years appeared remarkably ordinary. In 1963, Kraft enrolled at Claremont Men's College. The transition to college coincided with a period of profound cultural change across the United States. Social expectations, political movements, and conversations surrounding personal identity were evolving rapidly. According to the available information, it was during this period that Kraft began acknowledging his homosexuality, although he remained highly discreet about his personal life. The social climate of the 1960s offered limited acceptance for gay men, and many chose privacy over openness to avoid discrimination or social isolation. For Kraft, discretion became part of his identity. Those around him continued to see a quiet, intelligent student who revealed little about his inner thoughts. Investigators later noted that his ability to compartmentalize different aspects of his life may have contributed to his capacity to avoid suspicion for many years. While classmates focused on exams, careers, and the uncertainty of adulthood, Kraft cultivated an image defined by self-control and composure. Nothing publicly suggested that investigators would eventually believe his life contained another side entirely. After college, Kraft entered the United States Air Force in 1968. His military service was not centered on combat, but on administrative responsibilities, and he received training related to computers, a field that was rapidly expanding during the late 1960s. The experience provided him with technical skills that later shaped his civilian career. Reports from that period continued to describe him as intelligent and capable. Eventually, however, his military service ended when he was discharged for psychological reasons. Publicly available records provide little detail beyond that conclusion, and investigators have never identified the discharge itself as a direct explanation for the crimes that followed. Instead, it became one piece of a much larger life story that remained difficult to interpret even after his arrest. Returning to civilian life, Kraft entered the growing computer industry, eventually working as a programmer for Lear Siegler Industries. At a time when computer technology remained a specialized profession, his technical knowledge represented valuable expertise. Co-workers consistently described him in similar terms: polite, soft-spoken, organized, reliable, and professional. He dressed neatly, communicated calmly, and appeared focused on his responsibilities. These descriptions would later become central to the public's fascination with the case because they highlighted the extraordinary contrast between appearance and allegation. The image of a successful computer programmer seemed fundamentally incompatible with the crimes investigators believed he had committed. Yet history has repeatedly shown that outward normalcy can conceal lives unknown even to those who interact with a person every day. According to investigators, it was during the early 1970s that another pattern began developing alongside Kraft's professional career. While maintaining stable employment during the day, authorities later concluded that he spent nights driving along California's highways searching for vulnerable young men. Investigators believe the first murder occurred around 1971. The earliest identified victim associated with the investigation was 13-year-old Joseph Frankina. His body was discovered beside a road bearing evidence of strangulation and sexual assault. At the time, however, there was no suspect who could be linked to the crime. The case remained isolated, one among many unsolved homicides investigated by local law enforcement. No one yet recognized that investigators would eventually view it as the beginning of a much larger series. As additional victims appeared over the following years, detectives gradually observed recurring similarities. The victims were overwhelmingly young males, generally between 15 and 35 years old. Many belonged to groups considered particularly vulnerable. According to investigators, Kraft frequently targeted hitchhikers, military personnel, Marines, gay men, individuals struggling with drug use, and people experiencing homelessness. Such victims often traveled alone, making them easier to approach without attracting attention. Their disappearances also presented investigative challenges, especially before modern communication systems allowed rapid information sharing among jurisdictions. Some victims were stationed at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, placing them within areas investigators later believed Kraft regularly visited. California's extensive highway network became a defining feature of the investigation. Interstate 5, Pacific Coast Highway, Long Beach, Orange County, and San Diego all appeared repeatedly within investigators' reconstruction of Kraft's movements. Authorities concluded that these roads provided both opportunity and anonymity. Countless vehicles traveled the highways each day and night, making it nearly impossible to remember a single driver among thousands. A friendly stranger offering transportation to someone standing alone attracted little notice. According to investigators, Kraft understood that reality exceptionally well. They believe he typically approached potential victims in a calm, courteous manner. There was no immediate display of aggression. Instead, he allegedly relied on conversation, politeness, and the appearance of safety. Investigators concluded that alcohol often played a role in these encounters. Victims were reportedly offered drinks, and authorities believed tranquilizers were sometimes introduced as well. Once a victim lost the ability to resist, investigators alleged that restraint, sexual assault, and prolonged violence followed. The available evidence gathered during the investigation suggested a consistent method rather than spontaneous attacks. That consistency became increasingly important as detectives compared unsolved cases across multiple jurisdictions. Despite similarities, however, law enforcement agencies during the 1970s faced significant limitations. Counties often investigated murders independently, and information sharing was far less efficient than it would become decades later. A homicide in one jurisdiction might never be systematically compared with another occurring hundreds of miles away. Investigators now believe this fragmentation contributed significantly to Kraft's ability to avoid detection for more than a decade. The absence of modern DNA technology further complicated matters. Detectives relied primarily on fingerprints, hair evidence, blood typing, and traditional forensic methods. While valuable, those techniques rarely provided the certainty available through later scientific advances. Meanwhile, investigators believe Kraft maintained an outwardly ordinary lifestyle. He reportedly cleaned his vehicle carefully, preserved a professional appearance, and continued working without drawing significant attention. To neighbors and colleagues, nothing appeared dramatically different. Looking back after his arrest, many struggled to reconcile the individual they believed they knew with the evidence investigators would eventually present in court. The contrast between his ordinary public image and the allegations surrounding his private actions became one of the defining features of the case. As years passed, more young men disappeared, more bodies were discovered near highways, and more investigations began without recognizing that they might be connected. The emerging pattern remained hidden beneath the boundaries separating cities, counties, and states. No detective yet possessed the complete picture. That picture would only begin to emerge after a seemingly routine traffic stop in May 1983 placed Randy Kraft, his vehicle, and the evidence it contained under the scrutiny of investigators determined to understand whether the quiet computer programmer had concealed a far darker life than anyone had ever imagined. As investigators reconstructed Randy Kraft's movements across more than a decade, one conclusion emerged with increasing consistency. The crimes they believed he committed did not appear random. Instead, they reflected a repeated pattern that combined careful victim selection, calculated planning, and an understanding of how easily vulnerable individuals could disappear without immediately drawing widespread attention. While the exact number of victims remains uncertain, detectives concluded that the similarities among numerous cases pointed toward a method that remained remarkably consistent throughout the years. According to investigators, the murders are believed to have begun around 1971. The earliest identified victim associated with the investigation was 13-year-old Joseph Frankina. His body was discovered beside a roadway, and the examination revealed evidence of strangulation along with indications of sexual assault. At the time, however, there was no suspect capable of linking this homicide to any broader series. Detectives approached the case as an isolated crime, unaware that they might be witnessing the beginning of what would later become one of California's most disturbing homicide investigations. As additional bodies appeared in subsequent years, another pattern slowly became visible. The victims were overwhelmingly young males, most between the ages of 15 and 35. Their backgrounds varied, but investigators noticed that many belonged to groups whose disappearances could remain unnoticed for critical periods of time. Some were hitchhikers moving from one destination to another without fixed travel plans. Others were members of the military, particularly Marines stationed at Camp Pendleton. Some were gay men navigating a social environment that often required privacy, while others struggled with drug use or homelessness. Although these individuals came from different walks of life, investigators believed they shared one characteristic that made them especially vulnerable. Each could encounter a stranger without raising immediate suspicion, and their absence might not trigger an urgent search right away. Southern California during the 1970s offered an ideal landscape for someone seeking anonymity. Highways stretched across hundreds of miles, linking cities, military bases, beaches, suburbs, and industrial areas. Interstate 5 became one of the most significant roads in the investigation, running north and south through many locations associated with the case. Authorities also identified Pacific Coast Highway, Long Beach, Orange County, and San Diego as areas where Kraft frequently traveled. Thousands of vehicles moved through these roads every day, creating an environment where one driver could blend effortlessly into the flow of traffic. According to investigators, Kraft understood that anonymity was one of his greatest advantages. They believe he did not rely on force during his initial contact with victims. Instead, he reportedly presented himself as approachable and trustworthy. Well-dressed, soft-spoken, and intelligent, he allegedly offered rides to young men traveling alone. A friendly conversation, an offer of transportation, or a shared drink could appear entirely harmless. Witnesses who later described Kraft consistently portrayed someone who seemed polite rather than intimidating. That ordinary appearance, investigators believe, became an important part of his ability to gain the confidence of strangers. Once a victim entered the vehicle, investigators allege that the encounter gradually shifted under Kraft's control. Alcohol reportedly played a central role. Authorities also believe tranquilizers were sometimes administered, either openly or mixed into drinks, leaving victims increasingly unable to defend themselves. Unlike sudden acts of violence driven by immediate rage, investigators concluded that these crimes reflected preparation. The objective appeared to be complete control over another person before the physical assault began. Medical evidence gathered during the investigation suggested that many victims were restrained after losing the ability to resist. Hands and feet were reportedly tied, preventing escape. What followed became one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. According to forensic examinations, numerous victims experienced prolonged physical abuse before death. Detectives documented evidence of repeated sexual assault in multiple cases. Medical examiners also identified injuries consistent with severe beatings, bite marks, cigarette burns, and trauma inflicted by blunt objects. Importantly, investigators determined that many of these injuries occurred before death, demonstrating that several victims remained alive during portions of the assault. This finding significantly influenced prosecutors' understanding of the crimes because it suggested deliberate and sustained violence rather than impulsive homicide. Although discussing these injuries requires care and restraint, they remain essential to understanding why investigators considered Kraft among the most dangerous serial offenders in American history. The evidence indicated that the violence extended beyond killing itself and reflected an effort to dominate and degrade victims over extended periods. Such conclusions were based not on speculation, but on forensic examinations conducted during the investigation and later presented in court. The ultimate cause of death varied somewhat between victims, but strangulation appeared repeatedly throughout the cases examined by investigators. Some victims were believed to have been killed using ligatures, while others showed evidence consistent with manual strangulation. In certain cases, severe physical assault also contributed to death. Despite these variations, detectives concluded that the overall pattern remained remarkably consistent from victim to victim. Equally troubling was the condition in which several bodies were discovered after death. Medical examinations revealed that some victims sustained additional injuries after they had already died. In other cases, bodies appeared to have been redressed before being abandoned. Investigators interpreted these actions as evidence that the offender followed behaviors extending beyond practical efforts to conceal a crime. While the exact motivations remained known only to the killer, detectives viewed these repeated actions as part of an organized and ritualized pattern. After each killing, investigators believe Kraft carefully separated the location of the assault from the place where the body would eventually be found. Instead of abandoning victims immediately, authorities concluded that he often transported bodies considerable distances before disposing of them beside highways, in drainage ditches, near freeway exits, or within roadside vegetation. This strategy complicated virtually every aspect of the investigation. The location where a body was recovered rarely represented the actual crime scene, meaning detectives had little physical evidence connecting them to the place where the murder occurred. Without witnesses or obvious forensic links, reconstructing a victim's final hours became extraordinarily difficult. Geography itself became an ally for the offender. Bodies recovered across different counties naturally fell under the jurisdiction of separate law enforcement agencies. During the 1970s, communication between jurisdictions was far more limited than today. Detectives in one county might remain unaware of similar murders investigated elsewhere. Even when similarities existed, information often remained scattered among separate case files. According to investigators, this fragmentation significantly delayed recognition that many seemingly unrelated murders could have been committed by the same individual. The technological limitations of the era created additional obstacles. DNA analysis did not yet exist as an investigative tool. Instead, detectives relied on fingerprints, hair comparisons, blood typing, and traditional forensic methods. While valuable, these techniques lacked the precision available to modern investigators. Cases frequently depended on circumstantial connections, witness testimony, or physical evidence that was often incomplete after bodies had been exposed to weather and time. Throughout these years, investigators believe Kraft successfully maintained an outwardly ordinary life. He continued working as a computer programmer, preserved a professional appearance, and attracted little attention from neighbors or coworkers. Authorities later concluded that he exercised considerable care in maintaining his vehicle and avoiding behavior that might generate suspicion. The contrast between his public routine and the allegations emerging from homicide investigations became increasingly difficult for many people to comprehend. The image of a quiet, educated professional appeared fundamentally inconsistent with the repeated acts of violence investigators believed had occurred over more than a decade. Yet as detectives gradually assembled evidence from multiple jurisdictions, another unusual discovery would eventually deepen the mystery surrounding the case even further. Following Kraft's arrest in 1983, investigators recovered a small piece of paper containing 61 coded entries. At first glance, the document resembled nothing more than personal notes or cryptic reminders. Words and short phrases such as stable, idiom, Wilmington, Twiggy, Angel, Hari Carey, Navy White, England, Iowa, GR2, Portland Blood, MC Laguna, Skipper, and Lake Elsinore offered no obvious meaning. Yet detectives soon began comparing those entries with unsolved murders and known victims. Over time, several phrases appeared to correspond with identifiable individuals or specific circumstances. Investigators concluded that Stable was likely connected to Wayne Duquette, who had worked at the Stable Bar. EDM was associated with Edward Daniel Moore. Twiggy was believed to reference a victim whose body displayed an unusual and deeply disturbing detail involving a tree branch. Even so, many entries have never been conclusively explained. Whether each line represented a victim, a location, or another form of personal record remains uncertain. But investigators came to regard the document as one of the most chilling pieces of evidence recovered during the entire investigation. More than 40 years after Randy Kraft's arrest, the scorecard continues to symbolize the unanswered questions surrounding the case. It suggests that investigators may have uncovered only part of a much larger story, one whose remaining chapters would require painstaking forensic work, renewed investigations, and the difficult task of restoring identities to victims who for years were known only as unidentified remains discovered along the highways of California, Oregon, and beyond. For more than a decade, the investigation into the murders that would later be associated with Randy Kraft remained fragmented, not because detectives lacked determination, but because the crimes themselves appeared carefully designed to resist connection. Every new body discovered beside a highway, in a drainage ditch, or hidden among roadside vegetation became another individual tragedy investigated by local authorities. Each jurisdiction focused on its own crime scene, its own evidence, and its own victim. Without a centralized system capable of easily comparing homicide patterns across multiple counties and states, investigators were often unable to recognize that they might be pursuing the same offender. Looking back after Kraft's arrest, many detectives concluded that this separation of information became one of the greatest advantages the suspected killer possessed. California's vast geography played an important role in that challenge. Interstate 5 connected communities hundreds of miles apart, linking Long Beach, Orange County, San Diego, and countless smaller locations along the way. Thousands of vehicles traveled these roads every day, making them ideal corridors for someone seeking anonymity. According to investigators, Kraft repeatedly used these highways not only to encounter vulnerable young men, but also to transport victims far from the locations where the assaults were believed to have occurred. As a result, the place where a body was discovered often revealed very little about where the victim had actually spent his final hours. Detectives searching roadside vegetation or examining a drainage ditch could recover physical evidence from the body itself. But the original crime scene, the location where the violence unfolded, frequently remained unknown. This separation complicated nearly every stage of the investigation. Medical examiners could identify injuries and determine probable causes of death, but reconstructing the sequence of events required additional evidence that was often missing. Witnesses were scarce because investigators believed many victims had entered the offender's vehicle voluntarily after accepting a ride. Unlike public attacks committed before numerous observers, These encounters allegedly began in private, inside an automobile traveling along busy highways where one passing vehicle looked much like another. Even if someone remembered seeing a young man entering a car, recalling the specific driver or license plate days later was extraordinarily unlikely. According to investigators, this combination of mobility and privacy allowed the offender to move almost invisibly through Southern California. Another factor that slowed progress involved the identities of the victims themselves. Authorities gradually recognized that many of the young men shared characteristics that increased their vulnerability. Some were hitchhikers traveling alone with limited contact with family or friends. Others were members of the military, including Marines stationed at Camp Pendleton, whose schedules and transfers could complicate missing person investigations. Some victims were gay men living during a period when many concealed aspects of their personal lives because of widespread social prejudice. Others struggled with drug use or homelessness. None of these circumstances diminished the importance of their lives, but investigators acknowledged that they sometimes delayed recognition that someone had disappeared. Every day that passed before a missing person report was filed made reconstructing movements and identifying witnesses more difficult. Detectives later emphasized that these delays were not reflections of the victim's value but consequences of the circumstances surrounding their lives. The investigation also unfolded during a period before DNA analysis transformed criminal investigations. Modern audiences often expect biological evidence to produce immediate answers, but investigators working through the 1970s did not possess those tools. Instead, forensic specialists relied primarily on fingerprints, hair comparisons, blood typing, pain analysis, and other physical evidence available at the time. These methods remained scientifically valuable, but they required detectives to build cases piece by piece rather than relying on a single definitive laboratory result. Hair evidence might suggest association without proving identity. Blood typing could eliminate suspects more easily than confirm them. Paint samples required careful comparison and often depended upon locating a possible source. Every conclusion demanded patience, cooperation, and sometimes considerable luck. Investigators also believe that Kraft exercised unusual care in maintaining the appearance of an ordinary, disciplined life. He worked as a computer programmer, held steady employment, dressed neatly, and reportedly avoided behavior that attracted unnecessary attention. Co-workers consistently described him as polite, organized, and dependable. Such descriptions did not prove innocence, but they influenced perception. Violent offenders were often imagined as visibly unstable or openly aggressive, whereas Kraft's public image suggested precisely the opposite. According to investigators, this contrast allowed suspicion to remain focused elsewhere while the murders continued. As detectives revisited unsolved cases after his arrest, they increasingly concluded that his ability to compartmentalize different aspects of his life had become an important factor in avoiding detection. Despite these obstacles, certain similarities gradually began to emerge as investigators compared homicide reports. Victims were predominantly young males. Many displayed evidence of strangulation. Medical examinations repeatedly documented sexual assault and prolonged physical abuse. Some bodies had been redressed before being abandoned. Others displayed injuries believed to have occurred after death. Detectives realized that these recurring details were unlikely to represent coincidence. Instead, they appeared consistent with a single offender following a recognizable pattern over many years. Yet recognizing similarities was only the first step. Proving that one individual committed crimes scattered across different counties required evidence capable of surviving courtroom scrutiny. The turning point would not come through a laboratory breakthrough or the testimony of a surviving eyewitness. Instead, it arrived unexpectedly during a traffic stop on the night of May 14, 1983. When officers searched Randy Kraft's yellow Toyota Celica after discovering the body of Terry Lee Gambrill in the passenger seat. They recovered several items that immediately attracted attention. Among them were rope, tranquilizers, alcohol, photographs, and a small handwritten document unlike anything investigators had previously encountered. That piece of paper, later known as the scorecard, contained 61 short coded entries. At first glance, detectives had no idea what they represented. There were no full names, no dates, no addresses, and no explanation. Instead, the document consisted of isolated words and brief phrases such as stable, idiom, Wilmington, Twiggy, Angel, Hari Carey, Navy White, England, Iowa, Giarta, Portland Blood, MC Laguna, Skipper, Euclid, and Lake Elsinore. Investigators initially considered numerous possibilities. Perhaps the words represented travel notes, work projects, personal reminders, or coded messages unrelated to homicide. However, as detectives compared the entries with unsolved murder investigations, several phrases began aligning with known victims. One of the most significant examples involved stable, which investigators associated with Wayne Duquette, who had worked at the stable bar. Another entry, EDM, appeared consistent with Edward Daniel Moore. The phrase Twiggy was believed to reference a victim whose body displayed an unusual detail involving a tree branch, a feature investigators considered distinctive enough to explain the coded label. These apparent connections transformed the handwritten list from an incomprehensible note into one of the most significant pieces of evidence recovered during the investigation. Even so, many entries remain unresolved decades later. Investigators have never conclusively identified every phrase or demonstrated with certainty that each represented a homicide. Some may correspond to victims whose identities remain unknown. Others may refer to locations, events, or details understood only by the author. The uncertainty surrounding the document continues to influence investigations because every unidentified entry raises the possibility that additional victims have yet to be conclusively connected to Kraft. Following the discoveries inside the vehicle, investigators obtained search warrants for Kraft's residence and examined his personal records in detail. The searches produced an extraordinary quantity of evidence requiring careful analysis. Detectives collected fingerprints, hair samples, automotive paint evidence, thousands of photographs, travel records, and military documents relating to several victims. Each item had to be cataloged, compared, and evaluated against unsolved homicide investigations extending across California, Oregon, and Michigan. Rather than focusing on a single murder, investigators suddenly faced the possibility that one suspect might be connected to dozens of separate cases accumulated over many years. The sheer volume of evidence transformed the investigation into an enormous logistical undertaking. Detectives from different jurisdictions began sharing information that previously existed only within isolated case files. Bodies recovered years apart were re-examined. Missing person investigations received renewed attention. Forensic evidence collected long before Kraft's arrest was compared with material obtained during the searches. Gradually, investigators assembled a broader picture than any single agency had previously possessed. The ordinary computer programmer stopped on Interstate 5 was no longer viewed solely as the suspect in Terry Lee Gambrell's death. Instead, detectives increasingly considered whether they had identified the individual responsible for one of the largest suspected serial murder investigations in the history of the United States. Yet as the evidence continued accumulating, another challenge emerged. Collecting evidence and recognizing patterns were only part of the process. Prosecutors now faced the difficult task of determining which murders could be supported by sufficient evidence to present before a jury. Although investigators believed the true number of victims could be far greater, criminal convictions required proof beyond reasonable doubt. Every forensic report, every photograph, every travel record, and every coded word found on the scorecard would soon become part of one of the longest and most complex murder prosecutions ever conducted in California. where the legal system would begin the painstaking process of transforming years of investigative work into a case capable of withstanding the scrutiny of a courtroom. By the time prosecutors prepared to bring Randy Stephen Kraft before a jury, the investigation had grown far beyond the circumstances of a single traffic stop or even a single homicide. What had begun with the discovery of Terry Lee Gambrell's body inside a yellow Toyota Celica had expanded into a painstaking review of evidence gathered from multiple jurisdictions. Countless investigative files and years of unsolved murders. Detectives now faced a challenge unlike any they had previously encountered. They believed they had identified an offender who might be responsible for far more deaths than could realistically be prosecuted. Yet the courtroom would require evidence that met the highest legal standard. Suspicion, patterns, and investigative theories were not enough. Every allegation presented before a jury had to be supported by carefully documented physical evidence, expert testimony, and forensic analysis capable of surviving rigorous examination. The work that followed demanded extraordinary patience. Investigators cataloged thousands of items recovered during searches of Kraft's vehicle and residence. Fingerprints were examined alongside evidence collected from earlier homicide investigations. Hair samples were compared wherever possible using the forensic methods available at the time. Paint evidence recovered during the investigation was evaluated for potential connections. Travel records were reconstructed to establish where Kraft had been at different points over more than a decade. Military records relating to several victims, particularly Marines, were reviewed in an effort to understand how their paths may have crossed with the suspect. Thousands of photographs required individual examination because investigators believed they might contain clues capable of identifying victims or establishing timelines. None of this work produced immediate answers. Instead, each piece of information became one part of a much larger puzzle that detectives slowly assembled over several years. One document continued to occupy investigators' attention more than almost any other. The small handwritten list recovered from Kraft's vehicle had already become known informally as the scorecard. At first, it had appeared almost meaningless, a collection of isolated words and phrases with no apparent relationship to one another. As the investigation progressed, however, detectives increasingly viewed it as a possible record maintained by the suspect himself. The entries did not resemble ordinary reminders. They were brief, cryptic, and highly personal in their apparent significance. Words such as stable, EDM, Wilmington, Twiggy, Angel, Hari Carey, Navy White, England, Iowa, GR2, Portland Blood, MC Laguna, Skipper, Euclid, and Lake Elsinore continued to resist straightforward interpretation. Investigators believed each entry might correspond to a victim, a location, or a distinctive memory associated with a particular crime. Some entries gradually yielded possible explanations. Detectives associated Stable with Wayne Duquette, who had worked at the Stable bar. EDM appeared consistent with Edward Daniel Moore. Twiggy was believed to refer to a victim whose body displayed a particularly unusual characteristic involving a tree branch. Yet these identifications represented only a fraction of the 61 entries. Many others remain unresolved even today. Investigators have never claimed complete certainty regarding every line on the document, but they consistently regarded it as one of the strongest indicators that the crimes may have extended beyond those ultimately presented in court. The scorecard also reinforced another conclusion investigators had reached during years of reviewing homicide files. The offender appeared exceptionally organized. The document suggested that memories of the crimes were not left to chance. Whether each coded phrase represented a victim's occupation, location, nickname, or another identifying detail remained uncertain. But detectives believed the list functioned as a private system of record-keeping. Rather than collecting obvious trophies, the author appeared to rely on brief, coded reminders meaningful only to himself. That possibility deeply disturbed investigators because it implied that the murders may have been cataloged in a deliberate and methodical way. Nevertheless, prosecutors understood that speculation regarding unidentified entries could not replace evidence supporting specific criminal charges. As a result, the prosecution focused on those murders where physical evidence, forensic findings, and investigative work provided the strongest legal foundation. After years of analysis, Randy Kraft was charged with 16 counts of first-degree murder. Although investigators continued to believe the actual number of victims could be considerably higher, the courtroom would examine only those cases supported by evidence capable of meeting the burden of proof required under criminal law. This distinction became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Public discussion frequently centered on estimates ranging from 51 to as many as 67 suspected victims. Yet prosecutors carefully limited the charges to those they believed could be demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial itself began in 1988 and quickly became one of the longest serial murder prosecutions in California's history. The sheer quantity of evidence required extraordinary preparation. Jurors were asked to examine thousands of exhibits accumulated over years of investigation. Forensic experts explained physical evidence recovered from victims and crime scenes. Investigators described the painstaking process through which scattered homicide investigations had gradually been connected. The prosecution sought to demonstrate not only individual acts of murder, but also a consistent pattern linking the crimes together. Every document, photograph, forensic report, and physical exhibit became part of a larger narrative describing what investigators believed had occurred between approximately 1971 and 1983. The proceedings demanded exceptional concentration from everyone involved. Jurors faced the difficult responsibility of evaluating extensive technical evidence rather than relying on dramatic courtroom moments. Expert witnesses explained forensic findings according to the scientific standards available during that period. Investigators detailed the methods used to compare evidence recovered from multiple jurisdictions. Physical evidence collected during the searches of Kraft's vehicle and residence was examined, alongside material gathered years earlier from unsolved homicide investigations. Unlike fictional courtroom dramas where revelations often appear suddenly, the prosecution advanced through careful accumulation of facts, each intended to strengthen the overall case. Throughout the proceedings, Randy Kraft maintained his innocence. He did not confess to the murders. He offered no public explanation for the coded scorecard recovered from his vehicle, the document that investigators regarded as one of the most revealing pieces of evidence remained unexplained by the man accused of creating it. This silence ensured that many questions surrounding the investigation would remain unanswered. Detectives could compare entries with victims and develop reasoned conclusions, but only the author of the document could definitively explain every coded phrase. That explanation has never been provided. Another issue occasionally discussed during the investigation involved the possibility of an accomplice. Some investigators questioned whether a single individual could have committed every suspected crime without assistance. Several factors contributed to these discussions. Certain murders appeared to occur within relatively short periods despite significant geographic separation. Some victims would have been difficult for one person to transport alone. Investigators also recognized that Kraft maintained relationships with other men during various periods of his life. These circumstances prompted consideration of whether someone else might have provided assistance, either knowingly or unknowingly. Despite these questions, investigators never obtained sufficient evidence to charge another individual. No alleged accomplice was prosecuted, and Kraft himself never acknowledged receiving help from anyone. Consequently, the legal case proceeded on the basis that he acted alone in the murders for which he was charged. After months of testimony and exhaustive review of the evidence, the jury reached its verdict in 1989. Randy Stephen Kraft was found guilty on 16 counts of first-degree murder. The jury also determined that multiple aggravating circumstances, including evidence relating to torture and sexual assault, warranted the most severe punishment available under California law at that time. The court sentenced him to death. Yet even as the verdict concluded one of the state's most complex murder trials, it did not bring complete resolution to the investigation itself. The legal process had addressed 16 murders, but investigators continued to believe the full scope of the case extended much further. Numerous entries on the scorecard remained unidentified. Many victims discovered over the years could not be conclusively linked through the evidence available in court. Some unidentified remains recovered in California, Oregon, and elsewhere continued awaiting advances in forensic science that might one day reveal their names. The conviction therefore marked both an ending and a beginning. It ended Randy Kraft's freedom and formally established his responsibility for 16 murders under the law. At the same time, it opened a much longer effort to determine whether dozens of other unsolved deaths might eventually be connected to the same offender. Even decades later, investigators continue examining unresolved scorecard entries and unidentified victims, reminding us that while the courtroom delivered a verdict, the search for every victim's identity and for the complete truth behind the scorecard has never entirely ended. When the verdict was delivered in 1989, the legal proceedings against Randy Stephen Kraft reached their conclusion. But the broader investigation did not. For prosecutors, the conviction on 16 counts of first-degree murder represented the successful completion of one of California's most demanding serial homicide cases. For investigators, however, the verdict answered only part of a much larger question. The evidence collected over years of investigation, particularly the coded scorecard recovered from Kraft's vehicle, continued to suggest that the number of victims might extend far beyond those included in the indictment. Unlike many criminal cases in which a conviction effectively closes the investigation, the Kraft case remained open in a practical sense because detectives believed there were still unidentified victims, unresolved scorecard entries, and unanswered questions that no courtroom had fully addressed. One of the most significant challenges involved determining the true number of victims. Legally, the answer is straightforward. Randy Kraft was convicted of 16 murders. That figure reflects the crimes for which prosecutors believe they possess sufficient evidence to satisfy the demanding standard of proof required in a criminal trial. Investigators, however, consistently distinguish between convictions and suspicions supported by broader investigative findings. Through comparisons of unsolved homicides, missing person reports, forensic evidence, travel records, and the coded scorecard, many detectives came to believe Kraft may have been responsible for approximately 51 murders. Some investigative estimates extended even further, suggesting the total could approach 67 victims. These higher figures have never represented additional criminal convictions, nor have they been established as legal fact. Instead, they reflect the conclusions reached by investigators after years of reviewing evidence that often could not satisfy courtroom requirements because of missing witnesses, limited forensic technology available during the 1970s, or the passage of time. That distinction remains critically important. Criminal courts require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, while investigators are often tasked with evaluating patterns that may never produce evidence strong enough for prosecution. As a result, the complete scope of Kraft's alleged crimes may never be determined with absolute certainty. The scorecard itself remains central to those continuing questions. The handwritten document contained approximately 61 coded entries, each consisting of a word or short phrase without explanation. Investigators eventually associated several of these entries with known victims. Stable was linked to Wayne Duquette, who had worked at the Stable bar. EDM corresponded to Edward Daniel Moore. Twiggy was believed to reference a victim whose body displayed an unusual characteristic, involving a tree branch. These apparent connections strengthened investigators' belief that the document functioned as a personal record maintained by Kraft. Yet most of the entries have never been conclusively decoded. Phrases such as angel, Hari Kari, Navy White, England, Iowa, GR2, Portland Blood, MC Laguna, Skipper, Euclid, Lake Elsinore, and numerous others continue to resist definitive interpretation. Each unresolved entry represents another possibility. It may correspond to an unidentified victim, a known victim not yet conclusively linked to Kraft, a location, or some personal reference understood only by the author. Because Kraft has consistently maintained his innocence and has never explained the document, investigators have been forced to reconstruct its meaning through comparison rather than confession. Every successful identification has required painstaking investigative work rather than guidance. From the person who created the list, the possibility that unidentified victims remain connected to those entries has kept the investigation active long after the trial concluded. Advances in forensic science have also influenced the continuing examination of the case. During the years when the murders are believed to have occurred, DNA profiling was not available to investigators. Detectives relied primarily on fingerprints, hair comparisons, blood typing, and other physical evidence. Although those methods were valuable, they could not always establish the same degree of certainty later made possible through modern forensic genetics. As scientific techniques improved over subsequent decades, previously unidentified human remains and older evidence gained renewed investigative value. Cases that once appeared impossible to solve became candidates for re-examination using technologies unavailable during the original investigation. This continuing evolution of forensic science has ensured that the Kraft investigation remains relevant even decades after his conviction. One example illustrates this continuing process particularly well. In 2025, authorities announced that previously unidentified human remains discovered in Oregon had been identified through forensic genetic genealogy as Larry Eugene Parks. That identification represented a significant achievement in itself, restoring a name to an individual who had remained unidentified for many years. It also renewed investigative interest in whether Kraft may have been responsible for the death. Officials continued examining possible connections, demonstrating that the case remains active whenever new forensic developments provide opportunities to revisit unsolved homicides. Even after more than 40 years, investigators continue comparing historical evidence with modern scientific techniques in the hope of answering questions that earlier generations could not resolve. The Kraft investigation also occupies a distinctive place within the history of California's serial murder cases because of its association with two other notorious offenders. Randy Kraft is frequently discussed alongside William Bonin and Patrick Kearney as one of the three so-called freeway killers who operated in California during the 1970s and early 1980s. The comparison reflects historical context rather than collaboration. There is no evidence presented in the available information that these individuals worked together. Instead, the designation recognizes that each case involved victims whose bodies were abandoned near California highways, creating widespread public concern during the same general period. Among those three cases, investigators have often viewed Kraft as particularly unusual because of the suspected number of victims, the apparent organization reflected in the scorecard, and the prolonged period over which the crimes allegedly occurred. The scorecard itself remains perhaps the most distinctive feature separating Kraft's case from many other serial homicide investigations. Investigators have encountered offenders who collected physical objects, photographs, or other reminders of their crimes. Kraft's alleged record, however, appeared different. Rather than preserving obvious trophies, the document consisted of cryptic words meaningful only to its creator. Investigators believe each phrase functioned as a mnemonic device, a coded reminder capable of bringing an individual victim or event back to memory without revealing its meaning to anyone else. This interpretation explains why the document continues to fascinate investigators and criminologists. It suggests a highly organized offender who viewed the crimes as experiences worthy of systematic documentation while simultaneously protecting the information through private codes. Yet because so many entries remain unresolved, the scorecard also symbolizes the limitations of even the most determined criminal investigation. It represents knowledge that almost certainly existed but has never been fully recovered. Another unresolved issue concerns whether Kraft acted entirely alone. During the investigation, some detectives questioned whether one individual could realistically have committed every suspected murder without assistance. Certain crimes appeared to occur close together despite considerable geographic separation. Some bodies would have been difficult for one person to transport. Kraft also maintained relationships with other men during portions of his life. These observations prompted investigators to consider whether another individual may have provided assistance. Despite those questions, no evidence strong enough to support criminal charges against an alleged accomplice was ever discovered. Kraft himself has never acknowledged receiving help, and no additional person has been prosecuted in connection with the murders described in the available evidence. Consequently, the issue remains a subject of historical discussion rather than established fact. Today, Randy Stephen Kraft remains incarcerated on California's death row. His legal status has not changed the continuing work performed by investigators seeking to identify additional victims and decode remaining scorecard entries. Every unidentified victim who receives a name, every advancement in forensic science, and every re-examination of historical evidence carries the possibility of adding another piece to a puzzle that has remained incomplete for decades. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Kraft investigation lies not in the notoriety of the offender, but in the determination to remember those whose lives were taken. The public often remembers the nickname Scorecard Killer because it evokes the mysterious coded list recovered from his vehicle. Investigators, however, have consistently approached the document from a different perspective. To them, each coded phrase represents not merely an unsolved clue, but the possibility of an individual life waiting to be fully identified and acknowledged. Every successful identification restores more than a name. It restores history, family connections, and recognition that the victim existed long before becoming part of a homicide investigation. Decades after the traffic stop that ended Randy Kraft's freedom, that work continues, reminding us that while criminal trials eventually conclude, the pursuit of truth and the effort to honor every victim often extends across generations. The story of Randy Stephen Kraft does not end with a courtroom verdict or a sentence imposed by a judge. Instead, it continues as a reminder of both the strengths and the limitations of criminal investigations. His conviction established legal responsibility for 16 murders. Yet investigators have long believed that those convictions represent only part of a much larger and more complex history. Decades after his arrest, law enforcement agencies continue to compare evidence, examine unidentified victims, and revisit unanswered questions that first emerged during the investigation of the early 1980s. The passage of time has not erased those questions. If anything, it has made them even more significant because every year that passes increases the urgency of identifying victims, preserving evidence, and documenting historical truth before memories and records disappear. One of the most enduring legacies of the case is the way it demonstrated the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies. During the years when the murders were believed to have occurred, homicide investigations were largely managed within individual jurisdictions. A body discovered in one county became the responsibility of investigators in that county, while another victim found many miles away often resulted in an entirely separate investigation. Detectives worked diligently within their own communities, but information sharing was far more limited than it would become in later decades. According to investigators, this fragmentation allowed patterns to remain hidden for years. Similar methods of killing, similar victim profiles, and similar disposal locations were not always recognized quickly because the evidence remained scattered among numerous case files maintained by different agencies. Looking back, Many investigators concluded that the Kraft investigation illustrated why communication across jurisdictions is essential when crimes extend beyond local boundaries. It also highlighted the value of centralized databases and coordinated investigative efforts that have become far more common in modern policing. Advances in forensic science represent another lasting consequence of the case. When many of the murders were investigated during the 1970s, detectives relied on fingerprints, hair comparisons, blood typing, and traditional physical evidence because DNA analysis had not yet become available. Investigators did not lack commitment or skill. They simply worked with the scientific tools available at the time. As forensic technology evolved, however, evidence that once seemed limited acquired entirely new significance. Biological samples preserved for decades could be re-examined using methods unimaginable when the crimes first occurred. The identification of previously unknown victims through forensic genetic genealogy demonstrated that investigations do not necessarily end when a case grows old. Instead, advances in science can reopen possibilities that earlier investigators never possessed. The identification of Larry Eugene Parks through forensic genealogy in 2025 reflected precisely that principle. Although authorities continue examining whether his death may be connected to Kraft, the identification itself illustrates how technological progress can restore names to individuals who remained unidentified for decades. That achievement serves not only investigative purposes, but also deeply human ones, allowing families and communities to recover part of their history after years of uncertainty. Equally important is the reminder that the victims themselves must remain at the center of the story. Public attention often focuses on notorious offenders because their crimes appear extraordinary. Nicknames such as scorecard killer naturally attract headlines, documentaries, books, and public discussion. Yet every investigation begins not with the offender, but with individuals whose lives were interrupted by violence. According to investigators, Kraft deliberately targeted young men who often occupied vulnerable positions within society. Hitchhikers, military personnel, Marines, gay men, individuals struggling with drug use, and people experiencing homelessness shared no single life story except that investigators believe they became vulnerable to exploitation. Many traveled alone. Some lived far from family. Others belonged to communities that, during the 1970s, often hesitated to report disappearances immediately because of social stigma or practical circumstances. None of these factors diminish their importance. Instead, they remind us that vulnerability frequently arises not from personal weakness, but from circumstance. Every victim had a life that existed long before becoming part of a homicide investigation. Each possessed relationships, ambitions, memories, and a future that was never allowed to unfold. The continuing effort to identify unknown victims reflects an understanding that justice involves more than securing convictions. It also requires restoring identity to those whose names have been lost. The mysterious scorecard remains one of the most unsettling symbols within the entire case because it appears to reduce human lives to short-coded phrases understood only by its author. Investigators spent years attempting to reverse that process. Rather than allowing victims to remain anonymous entries such as Stable, EDM, or Twiggy, detectives sought to reconnect those codes with real people whose stories deserved recognition. Every successful identification represented more than solving part of a puzzle. It restored individuality where secrecy had attempted to erase it. Yet many entries remain unresolved, ensuring that the investigation continues. Those unanswered codes remind investigators that there may still be victims whose names have never been connected to the crimes. They also illustrate the limits of certainty. Even after decades of investigation, some historical questions resist complete resolution. That reality is neither unusual nor a failure of investigative work. Instead, it reflects the challenges created by time, geography, technological limitations, and the deliberate efforts of offenders to conceal their actions. Another enduring discussion surrounding the case concerns whether Kraft acted entirely alone. Investigators considered that possibility because certain aspects of the alleged crimes appeared difficult for one individual to accomplish. Some murders occurred close together despite considerable distances between locations. Certain victims would have been challenging for a single person to transport. Kraft also maintained relationships with other men during different periods of his life. These observations encouraged investigators to examine whether assistance may have existed. Ultimately, however, no evidence sufficient to support criminal charges against another individual emerged. As a result, the question remains unresolved. It stands as another example of the difference between investigative possibilities and legal conclusions. Responsible historical analysis requires acknowledging both what investigators suspected and what they were able to prove. The Kraft case also serves as an important lesson regarding appearances. Throughout his education, military service, and professional career, Randy Kraft consistently presented himself as intelligent, organized, and courteous. Coworkers described a competent computer programmer who rarely displayed anger or instability. Those descriptions did not conflict with one another. Rather, they demonstrate that outward behavior does not necessarily reveal private actions. Investigators repeatedly emphasized that his ordinary public image contributed to the length of time during which they believed the crimes continued. This observation should not encourage suspicion toward quiet or reserved individuals generally. Instead, it reminds us that criminal investigations must rely upon evidence rather than assumptions based on personality, occupation, education, or appearance. The case illustrates how carefully maintained public identities can complicate investigations, particularly when physical evidence remains scattered across numerous jurisdictions. Today, Randy Stephen Kraft remains on California's death row while investigators continue examining unresolved aspects of the case. The legal proceedings have ended, but historical inquiry continues. Every unidentified victim who receives a name, every advancement in forensic analysis, and every comparison between old evidence and new technology carries the possibility of answering another long-standing question. Whether the complete truth will ever be known remains uncertain. Some scorecard entries may never be conclusively decoded. Some suspected victims may never be definitively linked through available evidence. The exact number of lives lost may remain impossible to establish with complete certainty. Yet uncertainty does not diminish the significance of the investigation. Instead, it underscores the importance of persistence. The officers who stopped a weaving vehicle on Interstate 5 in May 1983 could not have imagined that. A routine traffic stop would uncover evidence leading investigators to one of the most extensive serial murder investigations in American history. Their discovery transformed not only a criminal case, but also the way investigators approach long-term, multijurisdictional homicide investigations. More importantly, it created an opportunity to seek answers for victims whose disappearances might otherwise have remained isolated and forgotten. In the end, the legacy of the Randy Kraft investigation is measured not simply by the conviction of one man, nor by the notoriety attached to the nickname Scorecard Killer, but by the continuing commitment to identifying victims, preserving historical truth, and remembering that behind every coded word, every forensic report, and every courtroom exhibit stood a human life whose value can never be reduced to a line on a piece of paper. As the story of Randy Stephen Kraft reaches its conclusion, the most important questions are no longer about notoriety or numbers, but about memory, accountability, and the lasting impact left behind by years of violence. The legal record identifies 16 murders for which Kraft was convicted. Yet investigators have consistently maintained that the full extent of the case may never be known. Estimates ranging from 51 to as many as 67 suspected victims reflect years of investigative analysis rather than courtroom verdicts. illustrating the difficult reality that criminal justice and historical truth do not always overlap perfectly. A conviction determines legal responsibility for specific crimes supported by sufficient evidence. History, however, often contains unanswered chapters that remain open long after a trial has ended. The Kraft investigation stands as one of those rare cases where the official judgment closed one part of the story while leaving another part unresolved. That uncertainty has shaped the case for decades. Every unresolved scorecard entry represents a possibility that another victim has yet to be conclusively identified. Every unidentified set of remains examined by modern investigators carries the hope that a forgotten individual may finally recover a name. Every advancement in forensic science creates another opportunity to revisit evidence collected many years earlier under circumstances that offered investigators far fewer scientific tools than exist today. The identification of Larry Eugene Parks in 2025 through forensic genetic genealogy demonstrates exactly how investigations continue to evolve. Although authorities have continued examining whether his death may be connected to Kraft, the identification itself serves as a reminder that scientific progress can restore identities long after traditional investigative methods have reached their limits. Such developments are significant not only because they strengthen criminal investigations, but because they acknowledge the humanity of victims whose identities were once unknown. Restoring a name means restoring family history, personal identity, and the recognition that each victim lived a complete life before becoming part of a homicide investigation. Throughout this case, one object has remained at the center of public fascination: the handwritten scorecard discovered after Kraft's arrest. To many observers, it appeared almost unbelievable that a series of cryptic words could hold such importance. Yet investigators gradually recognized that the document represented something profoundly disturbing. Rather than collecting obvious trophies, the person who created the scorecard appears to have relied on short-coded reminders capable of preserving memories that no one else could understand. Words such as stable, EDM, Wilmington, Twiggy, Angel, Hari Carey, Navy White, England, Iowa, GR2, Portland Blood, MC Laguna, Skipper, Euclid, and Lake Elsinore have occupied investigators for decades. Some have been associated with known victims through painstaking investigative work, while many remain unresolved. That continuing uncertainty gives the document an unusual place within criminal history. It is simultaneously evidence, mystery, and memorial. Each unexplained entry may represent an unanswered question waiting for future investigators equipped with better technology. Newly discovered records, or forensic evidence unavailable during earlier decades. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of the scorecard lies not in its mystery, but in the determination of investigators to reverse its purpose. If the document was intended to reduce individuals to coded memories known only to its author, the investigation has sought to accomplish the opposite. Detectives have worked patiently to replace anonymous words with real names, personal histories, and verified identities. Every successful identification transforms a cryptic notation into the story of an actual person, whose life mattered long before the investigation began. The case also remains an important reminder of how vulnerable populations can become disproportionately affected by violent crime. According to investigators, Kraft repeatedly targeted young men who were often traveling alone or living under circumstances that made them particularly vulnerable. Hitchhikers depended upon the kindness of strangers. Military personnel frequently traveled between assignments or spent time away from family support systems. Some victims were gay men living during a period when prejudice encouraged many to keep aspects of their lives private. Others struggled with homelessness or drug use, conditions that could delay missing person reports or complicate investigations. These circumstances should never be interpreted as reasons why the victims were chosen or as reflections of their worth. Instead, they illustrate how offenders may exploit situations where isolation, mobility, or social marginalization reduce the likelihood of immediate detection. Modern criminal investigations increasingly recognize the importance of ensuring that every missing person receives equal attention regardless of occupation, background, lifestyle, or social status. The Kraft investigation contributed to that broader understanding by revealing how fragmented investigations and delayed recognition can allow patterns to remain hidden for years. Equally significant is the case's influence on investigative cooperation. During the years when the murders are believed to have occurred, information sharing between jurisdictions was considerably more limited than it is today. Individual counties often pursued homicide investigations independently, with little opportunity to compare evidence systematically across large geographic regions. Investigators later concluded that this fragmentation delayed recognition of the larger pattern. The lessons learned from such cases helped reinforce the importance of coordinated investigations, centralized databases, and communication among agencies responsible for crimes spanning multiple jurisdictions. While no investigative system can eliminate every obstacle, improved cooperation has become one of the most valuable developments in modern homicide investigations. The case also demonstrates the remarkable evolution of forensic science. Detectives working during the early 1970s relied on the best methods available at the time, including fingerprints, hair comparisons, blood typing, and physical trace evidence. They pursued every available lead despite technological limitations that modern investigators know. Longer face. Advances in DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy have since transformed the ability to identify unknown victims and re-examine historical evidence. The continuing investigation into possible additional victims associated with Kraft illustrates how scientific progress extends the life of criminal investigations long after legal proceedings. Conclude. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the entire case remains the contrast between public appearance and alleged private conduct. Randy Kraft was consistently described as intelligent, polite, organized, and professionally successful. He worked as a computer programmer, maintained steady employment, and presented himself as a courteous member of the community. Those characteristics did not reveal the crimes investigators ultimately attributed to him. The case, therefore, serves as an important reminder that criminal investigations must depend upon evidence rather than assumptions based on personality, education, occupation, or outward behavior. The routine traffic stop on Interstate 5 that led to Kraft's arrest illustrates this principle. Clearly, the officers involved had no reason to suspect they were encountering a man who investigators would eventually connect to one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. They simply performed their duties during what initially appeared to be an ordinary traffic violation. That seemingly routine decision ultimately exposed evidence that reshaped years of unsolved homicide investigations across several states. More than 4 decades have passed since that night, yet investigators continue searching for answers. Randy Kraft remains on California's death row, maintaining his innocence and offering no explanation for the scorecard or the many questions that continue surrounding the investigation. Without cooperation from the man at the center of the case, detectives have relied instead upon evidence, forensic science, and careful historical reconstruction. Some mysteries may never be solved completely. The precise number of victims may remain uncertain. Several scorecard entries may never receive definitive explanations. Some families may never obtain every answer they have sought. Nevertheless, the investigation continues because each unresolved question represents the possibility of restoring truth where uncertainty once prevailed. In the end, the legacy of the Randy Stephen Kraft case is not defined solely by the crimes for which he was convicted or by the infamous nickname Scorecard Killer. Its deeper significance lies in the enduring commitment to identify every possible victim, to preserve the integrity of historical evidence, and to ensure that those whose lives were taken are remembered not as statistics, coded words, or anonymous remains, but as individuals whose stories deserve to continue. While the scorecard attempted to reduce human lives to private symbols, decades of investigative work have pursued the opposite goal, replacing secrecy with truth, anonymity with identity, and silence with remembrance. That effort continues today, reminding us that justice is measured not only by the punishment of the guilty, but also by the determination to remember every victim, pursue every unanswered question, and refuse to let even the oldest cases fade into obscurity. The case of Randy Stephen Kraft remains one of the most complex and disturbing criminal investigations in American history because it represents more than a series of murders. It represents the long struggle between evidence and uncertainty, between what investigators strongly believe and what can be proven in a court of law. The conviction of Kraft in 1989 provided legal accountability for 16 victims. But the investigation that followed continued to reveal a much larger and more complicated picture. For decades, detectives, forensic specialists, and law enforcement agencies have continued examining unanswered questions surrounding the suspected additional victims, the unresolved entries on the scorecard, and the possibility that the full story of the crimes may never be completely known. Yet beyond the statistics and investigative details, the most important part of this case remains the human cost. Every file, every photograph, every forensic report, and every coded word on the mysterious list represents a person whose life existed before becoming connected to one of the most infamous investigations in American history. The public often remembers Randy Kraft through the nickname Scorecard Killer, a name created from the document discovered inside his vehicle after his arrest. The phrase captures one of the most unusual elements of the investigation, but it also risks overshadowing the individuals whose lives were taken. For investigators, the scorecard was never simply a strange artifact. It was a possible pathway toward identifying victims who might otherwise remain forgotten. The words written on that small piece of paper represented unanswered questions. Behind every possible code was the possibility of a person, a family, and a story that had not yet received recognition. This distinction remains essential when examining the legacy of the case. Serial murder investigations often become focused on the offender because the actions of the perpetrator appear shocking and difficult to understand. However, the true purpose of an investigation is not to create a legend around a criminal figure. It is to uncover the truth about what happened and to seek justice for those harmed. The Kraft investigation demonstrates this principle clearly. The attention surrounding the suspect cannot replace the need to remember the victims themselves. The young men connected to the case came from different backgrounds, but investigators believed many shared circumstances that made them vulnerable. Some were traveling alone. Some were members of the military. Some were young men whose personal lives existed within a society where certain identities faced significant discrimination and social pressure. Others experienced instability that may have made their disappearances less immediately visible. These circumstances did not define their worth. Instead, they reveal how offenders may exploit isolation and vulnerability. The lives lost in this case were not defined by the circumstances surrounding their deaths. They were defined by everything that existed before those final moments: their relationships, their experiences, their hopes, and their individual identities. One of the most difficult aspects of the investigation has been the uncertainty surrounding the total number of victims. The difference between 16 confirmed convictions and the much higher estimates proposed by investigators reflects a fundamental challenge in criminal cases. The law requires specific evidence connecting a person to a specific crime. Investigators, however, must often consider broader patterns and possibilities. A homicide detective may recognize similarities between cases, identify recurring methods, and develop strong suspicions, yet still lack enough evidence to bring charges. This gap between suspicion and proof is one of the central realities of complex investigations. In Kraft's case, investigators believe the scorecard, missing person records, unidentified remains, and similar crime patterns suggested many more victims than those proven in court. However, the absence of complete evidence means that the final number may remain uncertain forever. The continuing search for answers has also shown how criminal investigations can extend across generations. Many detectives who originally worked on the case relied on technology that was considered advanced at the time, but now appears limited compared with modern forensic capabilities. The development of DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy has changed the possibilities for solving older cases. Evidence once considered insufficient may now provide new opportunities. Remains that were previously unidentified can receive names. Families who spent decades without answers may finally learn what happened to their loved ones. These advances represent a connection between past and present investigators, each generation building upon the work of those who came before. The case also highlights the importance of preserving evidence. Without careful documentation and storage, many historical investigations would lose the opportunity for future breakthroughs. Every piece of physical evidence collected decades ago may become more valuable as scientific methods improve. The continued examination of Kraft-related cases demonstrates why investigators must preserve even uncertain evidence. What cannot be explained today may become understandable tomorrow. Another lasting impact of the Kraft investigation involves public understanding of how serial offenders can remain undetected. The case challenged assumptions about what a dangerous criminal might look like. Kraft's background appeared ordinary in many respects. He was educated, intelligent, professionally employed, and described by others as polite and controlled. His public personality did not immediately suggest violence. This contrast became one of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation because it demonstrated that criminal behavior does not always present obvious external warning signs. However, the lesson is not that certain personality traits or occupations should create suspicion. Rather, the lesson is that evidence must remain the foundation of criminal investigation. Appearance, reputation, and social standing cannot determine guilt or innocence. Facts, forensic findings, and careful investigation are what reveal the truth. The question of whether Kraft acted alone also remains part of the broader discussion surrounding the case. Investigators considered whether another person could have been involved because certain circumstances appeared difficult to explain. Geographic distances, timing, and the challenges of moving victims led some detectives to examine the possibility of assistance. However, no individual was ever charged as an accomplice, and no evidence sufficient to establish another person's criminal involvement was discovered. This uncertainty demonstrates another challenge common in complex investigations. Not every possibility can be confirmed. Responsible analysis requires acknowledging what investigators considered while also recognizing the difference between a theory and an established fact. Ultimately, the strongest conclusion supported by the available information remains that Kraft was convicted for 16 murders and that investigators believe he may have been responsible for additional deaths that could not be proven in court. The legacy of the case also extends to the communities affected by the crimes. When a victim is unidentified or when a case remains unresolved, families and loved ones often carry unanswered questions for years or even decades. The investigation does not simply represent evidence and legal procedures. It represents the search for closure. The identification of victims matters because every person deserves recognition. An unknown victim is not merely an investigative challenge. That individual was someone who mattered to others. The effort to identify victims is therefore an essential part of justice. It acknowledges that even after years have passed, their lives remain significant. More than 40 years after Kraft's arrest, the case continues to attract attention because it remains unfinished in certain ways. The conviction brought punishment, but it did not answer every question. The scorecard still contains unresolved entries. Some suspected victims remain unidentified. Some families may still be waiting for information. Yet the continued investigation also represents hope. It shows that time does not completely erase the possibility of discovery. Each new scientific development, each recovered record, and each careful comparison of evidence may provide another opportunity to uncover the truth. The story of Randy Stephen Kraft is therefore not only a story about a criminal offender. It is a story about the people who were lost, the investigators who search for answers, the scientists who developed new tools, and the families who continued seeking recognition for their loved ones. It is a reminder that the purpose of justice extends beyond conviction. Justice also means remembering, identifying, and honoring those whose voices were taken away. The final chapter of the Kraft investigation may never be written completely. Some mysteries may remain unresolved, and some questions may never receive definitive answers. But the commitment to continue searching ensures that the victims are not forgotten. Their identities are more important than the codes written on a piece of paper. Their lives are more important than the reputation of the person responsible for their deaths. And their stories remain the true center of an investigation that continues to remind us of the importance of truth, accountability, and remembrance,